I am going to introduce you to someone who I respect an insane amount, not just because they're my boss, but because I've seen them grow as a leader over the course of their career, and has been an influencer for not just Trend Micro, but also for organizations around the world. Steve Quane is the Executive Vice President here at Trend Micro. Steve, welcome to the stream.
Hi, Mark. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Do you want to give the audience a little blurb about yourself, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I started as an aerospace engineer. Went into the military and then found myself in little mobile data centers in wartime zones. So I learned how to do data center ops there. After I finished that, I went and worked for Intel, kind of in a hosting division in Landesk. And then I've been at Trend for 20 years, working on security things, mostly on the R&D product management side. So building products.
Okay. Yeah, and fair to say, especially with that start to your career, you've seen a lot of different aspects to the industry. And I know one of the key things that you do for Trend, not only, obviously you have a huge amount of responsibility internally, but one of the things you get is the opportunity to talk to organizations around the world, which actually really ends up being a very interesting perspective, right? Like analysts talk to people through a certain, lens. Someone like myself, I'm out in the community talking to a lot more practitioners. The goal of today's episode was to try to contrast the executive view, which I think you represent really, really well, because you've got not only a deep technical background, but obviously you've been influential in Trend's business, but helping other organizations get a handle on technology in their business too. So my first question for you is probably way more open-ended and broad than it needs to be, but it's a good way to ease into this, I think. So having talked to organizations, continually talking to organizations around the world, what is sort of the first thing that comes to mind for executives when they're starting a cloud conversation at that top level?
Yeah, I think by far the first part of the conversation is nobody knows what in the world it is, right? So even just getting a frame of reference as to what cloud is, why it's different, how that impacts the decision-making and organizational processes is by far the beginning of the conversation. So we spend a lot of time with our customers. I usually work with either a security operations team or a CISO, which is a Chief Information Security Officer, usually reports up through IT, or more and more lately, DevOps teams and developers that are, kind of bringing cloud into the enterprise organization or government organization.
Okay. And, you said in your answer that most people don't know what it is. So let me ask you from your perspective, what do you feel when people say cloud, what is most likely are they talking about?
Yeah, probably the number one thing that I try to think of the board of directors of a company, right? So those are the people that the business has to answer to and telling them why we're going to do something. Mm-hmm. They think of things like Dropbox and Facebook. Sometimes they might know that their email's in the cloud, so they'll say, is that Outlook, right? That's usually where the conversation starts, right?
And that's fair, I think, and that's one of the reasons I thought this would be a good a good topic. And the team, when we started to discuss this, said, this is really interesting because a lot of the people who are dealing with it day to day, there's an assumption that we're all talking about the same thing. So if you talk to a team who's practicing a DevOps philosophy and building stuff, when you say cloud, they're talking AWS, Azure, or GCP, and they don't even think of Office 365 or G Suite or Dropbox or stuff like that, because they're like, no, that's like a decade ago. That's just what it is.
That's right.
But you see that regularly, where it's let's establish that baseline. And is it easy enough to explain that to folks when you're talking at a high enough level, or?
I think everyone struggles with getting a little too deep, and then people start getting confused. I think when a CISO or a CIO can say to a board or a business management team, if I do this, I can close down a data center, and that's X million dollars. That's when the conversation starts opening up to, oh, wait, this is not that, right?
Yeah.
Or do you know how our competitor launched this app that's killing us? Well, the reason we're really slow is because we're not using this thing called cloud. So if they can frame it in a business objective, usually it can at least get the people's attention, where they don't just think, oh, that's just technical mumbo jumbo. Who cares? Figure that out, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's always a challenge, especially for practitioners, for engineers, to take sort of your engineering hat off for a minute and go, wait a minute, we're building this stuff for a reason. not just because we find it cool, even though we do. So that leads to my next question, which is really, once that understanding is there, and you've sold them on the like, hey, we're going to shut down 3 data centers, we're going to save 30 million over the next few years in data center leasing alone. What is the executive concern or perspective on that migration? Because it's not like flip a switch and you're done. This is obviously a process that has huge business impacts.
Yeah, right. So I think one of the big issues is everything starts with a cost discussion and it doesn't stay there very long. So at some point, if you do shut down data centers and you move things to the cloud, the costs probably end up being similar, right? So at some point, those people have to migrate the discussion to speed of business, right? And that's, once again, just how do you define success? How do you define the metrics back to a business management team that your business is moving faster than it did before as a result of some technological investment, right? And that's a very, very difficult question. I work a lot with security people, so they have another layer of metrics on top of that, which is this safe, right?
Yep.
But even just moving to the cloud, how do you define the metrics that say that this is better than you had before? It's usually not cost in the end, right?
Yeah. The thing, based on my experience talking to people, the cost tends to stay the same. You just get more value, hopefully, for it if you're doing right. But how, especially given your perspective there, and I like to speak plainly in general, but given the bad track record of IT on delivering value, right? I mean, through the 90s and the early 2000s, IT projects only had like a 32% success rate, right? It's just ridiculous. Given that track record, how does the rest of the executive not sit back and go, okay, sure thing there, guy, like, yeah, technology is going to save us money, it's going to make us move faster, because it's been a cost center for so many years. How does that conversation go?
Yeah, not well. It usually doesn't go well, right?
Yeah, fair.
It's very hard to prove, very, very hard to convince people that the last big project I wanted and the 24 before that, this one's different. This one, it's really going to work, right? And even we have a conversation a lot about, as people move up the stack, and I know this is a technical audience, so I can probably go here, as people start talking about containers and Kubernetes and moving up, the word outsourced comes up as a word that helps describe why we can move faster, because we're outsourcing the pieces to Amazon. Once again, that's from a technological perspective, that seems pretty logical. The problem is the outsourcing industry also has a bad track record in IT, right? So for business people going, hey, I used to pay $1 billion to some system integrator to do this for us. You're just telling me I'm just paying $1 billion to Amazon? Is that the difference, right? Very, very hard to convince that it's a new conversation, right?
Yeah, because I think, most executives, when you say outsource, they're thinking bad help or support experiences, right? Where once they outsource something, it took them a week to get a new application installed on their system, or what, it's because that's most people's experience, or at least their most obvious experience with outsourcing is, I waited on the phone for an hour to talk to my cell provider to get something switched because they'd outsourced everything to a call center somewhere else. But it's at least a common term that people understand, because the outsourcing here is really a streamlined interface through an API for a set of commoditized services. But that's not exactly, doesn't flow off the tongue in a business conversation.
I mean, you said it very eloquently, but yeah, it usually doesn't work at coffee before the board meeting, right? Yeah.
Yes. Fair. So let's look at it from a bit of a different angle. For practitioners, right? For engineers, when we're sitting here looking at this stuff, it's a pretty solid technical argument, right? We get to focus on what actually matters as opposed to this undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? That's a term we use all the time. So it's really a win discussion. Is there something from the executives, like if I come to you and go like, hey, I'm going to roll all this stuff out because it just makes perfect sense. I get to focus on this. I get to use all these cool new toys. Does that raise alarm bells at the executive level? And, because I'm just assuming it's a win, is there risk factors that engineers don't necessarily see that executives do?
Yeah, I think, and this is a little bit of the struggle with new technology, is we need to understand the executives, including myself, have really no discernible skills whatsoever, right? So we've been managers for so long. Like the ability to impact something is difficult, right? So everything we do is enabled through groups of people, right?
Yep.
And so the ability to help understand what your boss and your executive need in terms of how do we measure what matters? How do we measure our competition in terms of, let's say, it's application delivery? Are we delivering value to our customers faster than the competition? Ultimately, we have to measure those things to get the business outcome we want. And if the engineers and R&D leaders aren't couching things in those terms, it's very difficult to rationalize the project in a new or exciting way. That answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does, because so a lot of that, what you just said, sort of echoes, and I know, or at least I hope you hear this from security teams you're talking to and CISOs you're talking to. It echoes the similar challenges that security has, right? In that security comes and talks about threats and exploits and all of these metrics that matter to security folks. And if I go to a security conference and say like, hey, I'm talking about this latest 0 day, and here's the CVSS score, and here's this, that, and the other thing, that's all in a language that security people understand. But as soon as you go outside of that security bubble, everyone's like, what? You want us to drop everything and jump on something for why? Like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the cloud people have their own language that no one understands as well, right? And you speak it. And so it's just understanding that two-way street, like understanding that the technology itself is not a business outcome. The value to the customer and the speed in which that's delivered and the experience the customer has is the outcome, and that's the whole justification for the discussion. Right?
And that's absolutely a choice quote, because you don't hear that often from the executive, which is great. But so that leads to a different sort of avenue, and I want to there's a fork we can take here, and I want to explore both branches. But first of all, both AWS, or all AWS, Azure, and GCP all have a cloud adoption framework. And, unlike some of the things like the well-architected framework, which is a technical set of guidelines and principles, the cloud adoption frameworks are, basically a mirror of each other. And essentially they're talking about mapping the business process. They're talking about how to identify stakeholders, how to identify how those business processes will change as you move into the cloud. And they're really that business attack plan of saying, okay, you're sitting in a data center today, you want to be in the cloud here. Here's how you move it, not just from a technology perspective, which turns out to be actually the easiest piece, but from a business perspective of going and saying, okay, Steve, you're the executive who owns marketing, for, let's say, and here's how you run your marketing right now. Here's how the new tools will impact you, and can we get buy-in? Can we move forward, and things like that. In the discussions that you have with organizations, around the world, do you see those frameworks actually being used? Because I read them as a practitioner level, as a sort of an advisor, influencer, and go, this is great stuff. But then when I try to see the rubber hit the road, it starts to cross a whole bunch of cultural and internal challenges. Do you see these things bubbling up at yours, or you just go, yeah, I know where the URL is, and that's as far as I see it?
Yeah, I think we hear about them getting referenced. I probably don't see them day to day, and even you just mentioning kind of organizational issues. Like, this is the thing I don't think people understand is I don't like the expression your service is only as strong as the weakest link, but in this case it's really super applicable. If the people that need to train, so say you're delivering a new B2B application to your downstream supply chain, if those people can't get trained and ready and enabled on that application, the whole thing is useless, right? And so the ability to take that cloud adoption framework, which is great in principle, and map it to my organization, I think that's where people get stuck, right? So I know Bob over in network security, and I know Tina in supply chain management, and I know how they work, and I can't just take this framework in there and do that. And so I hate the term re-engineering as well, but they kind of need to re-engineer how they speak to each other, how they talk. There's people that don't like each other, right? So it's just the organizational realities that I think the adoption frameworks are very interesting and a great place for discussion. It's just, how do you turn that into practical thinking and steps is just hard, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is the point, right? This was the whole goal of sort of this episode of the stream, was to get this kind of perspective, because I think it's really easy when you're seeing the advantages to you as an engineer, going like, "Hey, I used to have to spend, weeks to get this infrastructure in place to roll out my application, and now I can do it in 5 minutes with one command through CloudFormation or a template or whatever." You're right. There's so many clear advantages for engineers that we're just like, "Cool, let's go. Like as fast as we can, let's go." But the downstream impacts here are very, very real. And we see that. I was, as you were answering, the parallels in my head were going. We still have so many challenges bridging dev and ops to create, to implement the DevOps philosophy. And we're within the same organization, right? Like theoretically, we report under the same executive, and then now trying to bring security in for DevSecOps kind of thing. And that's still, again, all in IT. And the frameworks are all like, "Oh no, just go out and talk to the business units and it's fine. They'll just be bubbling in under the same." It is a utopian view. I wish it was true. But interesting. So that relates back to another question I wanted to ask. Seeing that that's not really bubbling up there, and understanding that every business is different, even though some of the core challenges are the same. Is there something that execs, like if a team comes up to you and goes, "Okay, we're going to be moving into the cloud. Here's why we think those advantages. We're going to spend the same, but we're going to get more value. We're going to be able to hopefully move things faster." Is there an executive perspective on which cloud provider to pick? Are there like factors that determine into that?
I don't think so. I think that the executives are too removed from that decision, and once again, it's back to enabling and trusting the team. So at some point, somebody in the organization is going to say, "I think we should choose Amazon. Here's why," or "I think we should choose Google. Here's why." And once again, the delegation of that is really critical. So trust and personal relationships do show up at some point, and that the executives probably, other than credit history and, is this company going to go out of business? They just can't put a context around that, right?
Okay. But that decision then comes down to, like you said, the trust in the people who are making that call. And do you think an executive, so let me give you a hypothetical, because when I asked, my team and said, like, what should we be asking for this? Because obviously I'm more on the practitioner side than the executive side. And I'm like, cool technology, let's go. The one of the questions they brought up was a really, for me, I went, oh, well, that's a good one. So, having understood your answer, they're saying, you've got good people underneath you who are making the decision based on their perspective. Let me pose a hypothetical. Would an executive, if the team came up and said, "Hey, for reason XYZ, we want to go with Google Cloud," and you're already a Microsoft shop, and you have a contract, you've got Office 365, you got a bunch of other products there. Do you think there would be a point, and maybe what are the parameters around that point, where an executive would say, "Hold on a second, there's a big business savings here to renegotiate a bigger deal than just what you want"?
Yeah. For sure. Absolutely. In fact, that one specifically is a very interesting example, because I've got Microsoft productivity licenses across my entire organization that probably add up to millions and millions of dollars. Microsoft can come in and bundle that Azure with that. And if that's particularly, let's say in today's environment where cost is becoming a big concern again, I might have to try to weigh in and change that decision just because we can't afford it, or we can't take that risk at the moment. Oh, for sure. And that, unfortunately, that's where the vendor sales teams come in and make it hard for everybody, right? They'll come in and do this and wrangle it up and go, "I take that renewal and that renewal," and they confuse everybody so much that nobody even knows if they save money, right?
Yeah.
Nothing against salespeople in the industry.
No, but I mean, that's their job too, right? And I mean, why not? If a company's in that position, on paper, that should be the benefit to the customer as well, right? Like, hey, we're able to knock everything down 20% or 30% because you've reached this new tier of spending money with us. So, we can give you a better terms. But that obviously, if those scenarios pop up, and I have to believe based on my experience, they do quite often, that leads to the challenges, at an exec or at an organizational level of dealing with multiple clouds, odds are, because there are probably, while for the baseline, all the big three are pretty much the same. If you want some storage, a data store, and some servers or containers, you've got with a few technical differences, they're pretty much the same. But in specific areas, if you wanted to leverage things like AI, there's a bigger difference, and some specialty stuff. So inevitably, if we were in that scenario where I said, hey, Steve, I want to go with, cloud A, and you said, no, we can get a better deal with B for everything and save a huge amount of money, I would probably still have to say, okay, I can build most of it in B, but in A, I'm going to have to use this service and this service to get there. So now we have multiple clouds. Does the word multi-cloud reassure executives or terrify them, or is it just not even on the radar?
Yeah, I think at a high level, it starts as a reassurance. It is, I have some pricing leverage. I've got option B. But then when they get down to skill sets and staffing, and they actually get an indication of the fact that you need almost two separate teams, maybe not separate, but two distinct skill sets because the clouds are different, then the conversation gets a little harder. So it depends on how deep they go into that discussion. And I do think I can't emphasize this enough. Going back to business metrics is probably the best way to even start the discussion, because plan B and cost is not a great way. It's where they're going to naturally gravitate. I'll give you a good example. I worked with a hoster recently who has a very, very large server infrastructure, tremendous. It's a small, medium business hoster. They have tons of attacks, DDoS, Bitcoin mining, just endless on their environment. And at some point, they brought in a new CISO, and the individual said to me, my number one metric is cost of consumption of CPU for security. And I said, you're going to judge all your security teams on cost in terms of CPU consumption of server security. And he said, yep. And I kind of sat down. I said, is that a good way to measure security? Right. Mm-hmm. And he made a really good case. He said, look, our margins in our business are 2 to 3%. If you come in and you take 20% of a server to do all the security functions you have, you've possibly put that entire service out of business already. So yeah. I have to find some balance between security efficacy and consumption of CPU, because I'm stretching 10 million SMB websites or 10 million e-commerce sites across my entire infrastructure. We're talking pennies here, right? Mm-hmm. And it's just fascinating to me that as a security professional or technician, let's put it that way, I would never define security effectiveness in terms of percent of CPU. Oh my gosh, I would never do that. But this person is answering to a board that says, look, if your security takes up X more cost than this, you're out, it's out, we're starting over. We can't afford that, right? So just understanding the context of the business and how those decisions get rolled in, obviously the average engineers, that might be a little bit kind of a big task to ask, but it's super relevant in how we build and measure things, right? That makes sense?
Yeah, it's funny. As you were explaining that, I was thinking that's crazy. But as you finished out, I said, in my head, I kind of went, that's actually a genius way to tie an identifiable metric to a desired business outcome, right? Because that's a huge gap for security, is often tying back to the business, because we're trying to prove what didn't happen, right? So we didn't get hacked and we didn't get held for ransom and this didn't happen. But you can't prove that it would have if you didn't take action necessarily, right? Whereas the case you just explained is a easy thing to monitor, percentage of CPU. We got tons of tools that'll do that. Related directly to the business concern of, if you're over this amount, then our margins are gone. So it's a very quantifiable way of the challenge of security is, are you spending more to protect the data than what it's worth?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And but I never would have thought of it, right? That's not something, if you sat down and said, hey, protect this, this hosting infrastructure, that would have never occurred into my head. Until way down after many, many conversations going oh, I guess we could do this. But it's simple, and it's genius in its implementation. I like it. Okay, so back to the bigger question around cloud in general. So you're saying a lot of this is trusting the team, building it out, and understanding that there are some times when an executive would need to weigh in and say, hey, we need to have bigger concerns on economies of scale and stuff like that. But is there visibility into this process? Because normally, it's been my experience, at least, and I think a lot of practitioners out there, this ties to the bigger DevOps philosophy and movement, is once you start adopting these tools, and after you finish that initial migration, you start to go more cloud native, become more cloud fluent, and that starts to change the way you're working. Is there visibility that executives want at that point or throughout this process? And is there stuff that's useful that they don't have?
Yeah, it's probably back to that speed discussion. You know, if we can say that we're delivering value to our customers hourly versus every 9 months. So if you can chart that kind of either per application or per business function, that will really resonate.
Okay.
And how we define that and how we measure it obviously is probably organization specific.
Mhm.
But I do have a weird kind of stuck on the metrics thing. I have
Good.
another interesting example in the security realm. Obviously, that's where I sit a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
I remember we were working with a very, very sophisticated customer who was doing essentially using the cloud to move their security infrastructure into the cloud to use the AI framework. So to do anomaly detection. And so they had, in addition to protection, they had added detection.
Okay.
And so there were two problems. One, this person said, well, all the DevOps people that are sitting in the cloud building cloud native stuff, they chose their own security tools. So I don't know how to normalize any of that data that's coming back into my security operations, right? So you had the speed to go do what you wanted to do, but now I need to bring that back into an operations function, and you've created a complete nightmare, right? All this telemetry, I don't know how it's formatted. I don't know what it means, right? But anyway, this person was super sophisticated, and they were probably tracking about 100 more things than what I would call a normal security operations center would track, right?
Okay.
At some point, they had to report back to the board as to their risk management, how risky they were, and this person brought a lot of data, and they said, "Hey, look, we've got this and this and this and this." Well, a couple months into that, one of the board members leaned over to the CIO and said, "You know, I was sit on some other boards, and they get attacked way less often than you guys do."
Uh-huh.
And so the CIO and the CISO were very close, and the CIO said, "No, we just track it better. We have more visibility, and so we all think more data is better.
Mm-hmm.
Cloud gives you more data. You can automate. You can get more telemetry. You can do big data analysis using the cloud engines, so you don't have to go build it yourself and do all the data management. However, if we can't package that up in ways that makes sense to people, doesn't look overwhelming. Like this security professional had the best telemetry data in the world, probably for that vertical at least.
Yeah.
And he was essentially going to get in trouble because it just looked like way more going on in your company than other companies, right? Other companies just like 10,000 attacks, we blocked them all, right? No problem, right? So I think we need to understand as we move into cloud native, the instrumentation, the data, it's just brilliant. But we still need to package that up and clean it up and make it digestible in a way. We can't just send all that to other people, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is a theme in a lot of your responses, which is great. Because it's a key takeaway for the audience here is that presenting it in context is critical, and part of that context is narrowing what you present. I know I was giving a talk on risk and how to make risk decisions last week for all the talks online, and that was one of the things I was tackling. Whereas without context around the data, numbers can be interpreted different ways. And I'd used a really morbid example because it made sense to people, which was pedestrian fatalities in general. Again, horribly morbid example. But when you say, oh, there was 300 deaths a year here in Canada where I am, it sounds really, really bad because you don't have the context. Right? If there was 300 deaths at 301 pedestrian, occurrences, then that's horrible. But if there was 3 billion or 300 billion, it's still tragic. But in context, it makes more sense, right? In that it's a tiny, tiny fraction of what's going on. And this is sort of the happier version of theme in your answers. In that coming and saying with these amazing metrics, saying like, look at all this stuff, we know what's going on, and like you said, that person probably had the best data and the best level of situational awareness, which is their job out there, but that needs to stay within their bubble, and outside of the bubble they just seem to be like, we're good.
or even just understand that you've got to educate who you're talking to on the fact that you have more data and it's better and you've got better situational awareness, and that what you're doing is not bad, it's good, and just you've got to take that time. for your audience.
Yeah, and I think it's the interesting thing is if you think about the companies that board member was on, the other companies, the one of the biggest gaps, and the engineering sort of science side of me always pulls out what's left of my dwindling hair and graying hair, is we don't present like confidence levels with the numbers, right? So when you come up to an exec and say like there were 10,000 attacks, and it's like, oh, okay, that good, I'm going to take your word, there was 10,000 attacks, but you don't say out of the ability to only monitor 5% of our infrastructure, or like there's not the confidence in there. Whereas this guy, this example you're talking about, this guy had an insanely high confidence level in his data, which means if he was saying there was X number of attacks, it was probably that down to the 1 or 2.
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas the other board's going like, oh no, we got attacked 100 times, and I have a confidence of near 0 in that number. But he doesn't say that second part.
That's right. That's right. I will say it is where the overtime metric matters greatly. Like the bad thing about executives is they have no skills, but the good thing is a lot of stuff comes at them, right?
Yeah.
So they have seen a lot of things, right? I think President Obama from the U.S. Even said, if it reaches his desk, it's not obvious. The answer is not obvious, right? If so, it would have been made downstream, the decision, right? And so over time is critical, because you can at least, people know in the executive seat that things are broken. They know nothing's perfect. If you can say, hey, we're getting better. Here's what it was 6 months ago. Here's the things we did. Here's why it's better. That is huge to just say we're improving, right?
Yeah.
Part of risk management. It's part of performance management. It's part of business management. And I think people don't recognize that no one expects perfection. We don't expect perfect data. But if you could show that we're discernibly getting better over time, that's all anybody's asking for.
And that, I think, is a key one, especially for practitioners, because I think a lot of the time we get obsessed with result and not the sequence of results, right? So we sit there and go like, hey, we got the build down to like an hour, and we're like, that's awesome, or we're at an hour, as opposed to, what I'm hearing from you would be more effective of going, 6 months ago, it took us 3 days to do this build. And 5 months ago, it took us 2 days, and 3 months ago, like we keep whittling it away with these small investments, and we've reached this point now, which we think is adequate to meet our needs, and blah blah blah. But it's that constant improvement to show like, hey, we're doing better. And I have a feeling that would make that argument of that we talked about in the early stages of this conversation of like, hey, we're moving faster, and look, here's evidence of us moving faster over time. Right. To the executive level, right? Because that's that impact. Changing gears a little bit. So here at Trend, you've been at Trend Micro for a long time. You've seen a lot of stuff. Obviously, we're like any other company. We've got 7,000+ employees around the world. We make a ton of different products for a ton of different verticals, all around helping people secure their digital world. But we have teams that are in various stages of cloud migration and cloud transition as well. Right. Obviously, our teams who are working with Cloud One, which is our cloud workload or cloud builder suite, it should be more in the cloud, and they are. Then teams who are building hardware products that they're still protecting data centers, and obviously that makes sense for each of the problems that these teams are tackling. But from the executive level, that must be pretty interesting, because you've got a wide variety of this transformation going on, and sort of seeing potentially in the future, hopefully learning from mistakes, and helping teams bridge that gap. But from your perspective, what does that look like when you've got a number of teams who are at various stages of this process?
Yeah, it's super, super difficult. We have some products that are even made of wood, I think. No, it's really difficult. We did take a concerted effort as a company probably 18 months ago to say we have got to either rebuild everything or transition everything into more cloud native, cloud infrastructure based technologies. And in some cases, that did mean we had to revamp teams and bring in new people. In other cases, we could train and kind of take the people we had. And you're right, we're very globally distributed. Even the infrastructure is different, very different in countries. I'll give you a good example of regional challenges. There's a thing called Golden Week in Japan next week. It's a big holiday. Everybody takes the whole week off. Our customers, including some governmental agencies said you are not allowed to publish code during this week. And
That's a new one.
Yeah, one of our applications is publishing about every 2 hours, and we said we can't do that. And so we're in a negotiation on how. So it's not just our employees; it's also our customer base. They can't handle us publishing things every week and wondering if it's going to break, or every hour and wondering if it's going to break. So it's very, very difficult to manage. It's super interesting that it's really hard to get people to understand what DevOps even is. And then to bring other functions into that is super, super challenging. For instance, I had somebody in one of our app teams the other day say to me, I have to learn about security, but the security people don't have to learn about DevOps. Is that fair? Right? That's a great discussion at an organization, right? Are we both learning each other's jobs? And so, I don't even know if I'm answering your question, but
how do we? Stuff, don't worry.
Yeah, how do we deal with that transition? We have personally added performance metrics to everybody's performance reviews that are cloud oriented. So, say you're an AIX developer, you still carry a AWS certification objective or something like that, just to bring the whole company into the new world. But we have hundreds of thousands of customers on legacy infrastructure, and they're trying to move too. It's not easy. It's not easy.
No, and I mean, and it makes sense. And that's the thing that always gets me, is that nerd me is always like, let's go super cool, cutting edge all the time. But I've been practicing for long enough to realize it's a process, right? And it takes time. And even though there are cool technical reasons you may want to do something, the business reasons run counter to that and should beat the technical reasons most of the time. But one of the things that I think might bubble up to the executive level, that within this context of knowing that Trent's got a whole bunch of teams, and you've got teams directly in reporting into you that are at various stages of this.
Yeah.
I know specifically we've got a couple teams that are, have built serverless services, very cutting edge, that have a lot of great knowledge because, they've been there from the start of sort of the serverless push. And they have their own, goals and metrics that they're driving to, helping customers, delivering features and stuff like that. But from the executive perspective, I imagine you've got to be looking at that sort of hard-fought knowledge of how to do that and going, I need some of that over here as well. How do you strike that balance of going, okay, I need you to pause a second or slow down a little bit on delivering that direct to your mission, to look at the bigger mission of, you can help these other people who are building the products made of wood come into the serverless world, or come into that mentality? Because really it's mentality now. Anyone, most of the engineers, you can give the docs and they'll figure it out. But to get them into that mindset of going, hey, okay, I don't want this, I want that instead.
Yeah, there's a couple different things we've done. And by the way, we're probably not great at it, just to be clear. But we do rotate a fair amount. We have been moving leaders from one team to another to get some of those practices across the board. We've brought in external people. We actually work with the Azure team greatly. One of their original Azure developers kind of created an internal practice at Microsoft to they transitioned essentially 60,000 people to kind of a DevOps, and they did a really good job. And so we brought him and his team in to help us. Nice. I know that we're using some of the Amazon services. The name escapes me on how to build cloud infrastructure. SaaS project or something.
One of they've got a bunch of
some name like that. Yeah. So we aren't relying only on internal. We are relying on some external factors as well, and obviously the objectives and the metrics help. If you're not going to get your bonus because you don't move your application or your customers to SaaS, that's a big deal. You can't buy your car because you stayed on Linux on premise, right? Yeah. So I think we're just trying a bunch of different tips and tricks. I will say this though, I think at some point pride is the best motivator.
Really?
And when we have an application that does a major release every 9 months, and there's another one that gets to bring features into the market in a week, and they know that their customer, those products actually are doing quite well. They see the
Hmm.
business success. They see the
Hmm.
engineers delivering value. They see the interaction between customers and engineers that doesn't exist in the waterfall model.
Yep.
I actually think that's probably the best motivator. So we just try to highlight our successes on the DevOps side, and the customer impact, and the speed in which we're moving, and how fast we've beaten the competition. That's a big part of the discussion, is that pride, that engineer
Yeah.
pride of,
And I think that's invaluable, hearing that perspective from you, from knowing that you're dealing with this in your day to day, as an executive and as a leader, understanding that there's no one way, right? Is that if you are sitting back, because I've seen organizations try to do this and go, this is how we're getting our people into that cloud mentality. Everyone will walk this one path. But what I'm getting from your answer is realizing that may get a chunk of people over, but you need to, cross-pollinate. You didn't need to bring outside voices in. You need to get different exposure and find that, that one motivator, whether, pride by direct showing that somebody's kicking your butt, or, whatever the case may be. But I mean, that's really practical advice, in that don't count on one thing to do it. You need to hit them again and again from different angles with the same message. That will eventually move things forward, right? And I think from the engineering and the practitioner side, we look for the simple, like, oh, this will get the ant. Like,
that's right.
I do one thing and I'm done, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we even have focused. We don't do many acquisitions, but we did one recently, application written entirely in Lambda, and that was a big part of the acquisition was the product, of course, but it was also this skill set. And we had to stabilize that company and bring them in, but at some point they're going to be running other Lambda applications and functions at our company.
Yep.
We won't keep that just on that application. So acquisition, bringing in new talent has helped a lot.
Nice. Okay. So yeah, that's mixing up at a much bigger scale, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a win-win, right? Because you advance the business interests in general by having a new product and a new offering, but also you can improve the rest of the business by having a big sort of thumb on the cultural transformation scale by bringing in enough people that it's not like you bring in, because a lot of teams will bring in one or two people, and those people, unless they are ridiculously strong personalities, tend to get sort of weighted down by the existing culture. You can't bring in one person to transfer a culture, but if you bring in a whole unit, you can, like, it's enough weight to get that rock over the hill.
Right. Yeah, and our teams are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? That helps too, right? Just creating that decoupling. We used to have teams that were 400 people working on one monolith, right? That's just, so organizationally, structurally, we just got to keep pushing, keep funneling towards the right model as well. So people don't always understand, hey, why are we breaking up this team? We're working great. Well, you're working great, but you're not moving fast enough in the new infrastructure, and maybe organizationally, structurally, you'll change your behavior just by having a different team structure, right? So yeah, just another piece, right?
And I think that's really important, especially that organizational change one, because I think this, especially at the engineering level, we focus so much on the technology change, is that we don't realize that as people, we get stuck in a way of doing things or relying on certain people. Like, I always come to you for this. I always come to you for this. And it's like, well, you need to break that habit at some point to sort of raise everybody's level up, so that the team in general is better, right? As opposed to just having one or two all-stars. You want everybody to be very, very good.
Yeah, that's right. I think the Rockstar All-Star thing is a super interesting conversation. I personally believe that we need a couple rock stars, but we also need people that are functional experts that just get their work done, that are just proud of their components. And I think the rock star thing can really destroy an entire organization if you focus too much on it, right? So we do need these brilliant security architects or cloud architects, or people that are just brilliant in cloud native infrastructure delivery or AI. But we also still need to build front end interfaces, and that can be in Lambda. The technology doesn't have to be that part, but it can't all be architects.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point, right? Because there is a common belief, especially in a lot of startups out there, is just, let's just go hire all the best people we can, and there's no thought to team balance. Right? There's no thought to that. Let's get a strong team out there, as opposed to let's just hire we can afford 5 of the best people out there. Let's just buy them and let's get them on board. And then we have a whole bunch of people who are, I'm a basketball guy, so I keep thinking like we've got a few like Michael Jordans, then a whole bunch of Washington Generals. And it's like, the guys who always play the Globetrotters and have never won a game in 50 years. And it's like, that's not a good balance. Like, yes,
Right.
Michael Jordan's the best ever, but you have the worst ever beside him. You need a whole balanced team where everyone contributes, right? And contributions come in different ways.